Welcome back, Mitchell Mustangs. Thank you so much for watching lesson number 2 for language arts. Today I invite us all to think about genre and something for us to understand that great readers understand is that great readers identify genre as we read, and then we use that knowledge to help us to enjoy the book that we're reading or the text that we're reading, and it also helps us to better understand what we're reading. So, as we read on in Charlotte's Web today, let's think about we know this is fiction. Fiction contains characters, setting, plot, lots of different events, usually problems and resolutions. What type of fiction is this book, is what I'm thinking as I'm reading on. Right now, it feels realistic fiction, somewhat because of Winn-Dixie would be a book that I would compare this to. We have a family, we have this little girl who now is taking care of this wonderful pig, Wilbur, and it feels real as of now. So today, as we read on, let's think about, is this realistic fiction? Wilbur's new home was in the lower part of the barn, directly underneath the cows. Mr. Zuckerman knew that a manure pile is a good place to keep a young pig. Pigs need warmth, and it was warm and comfortable down there in the barn cellar on the south side. Fern came almost every day to visit him. She found an old milking stool that had been discarded, and she placed the stool in the sheepfold next to Wilbur's pen. Here she sat quietly during the long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. The sheep soon got to know her and trust her. So did the geese who lived with the sheep. All the animals trusted her. She was so quiet and friendly. Mr. Zuckerman did not allow her to take Wilbur out, and he did not allow her to go into the pig pen. But he told Fern that she could sit on the stool and watch Wilbur as long as she wanted to. It made her happy just to be near the pig, and it made Wilbur happy to know that she was sitting there right outside his pen. But he never had any fun. No walks, no rides, no swims. One afternoon in June, when Wilbur was almost 2 months old, he wandered out into the small yard outside the barn. Fern had not arrived for her usual visit. Wilbur stood in the sun feeling lonely and bored. There's never anything to do around here, he thought. He walked slowly to his food trough and sniffed to see if anything had been overlooked at lunch. He found a small strip of potato skin and ate it. His back itched, so he leaned against the fence and rubbed against the boards. When he tired of this, he walked indoors, climbed to the top of the manure pile, and sat down. He didn't feel like going to sleep. He didn't feel like digging. He was tired of standing still, tired of lying down. I'm less than 2 months old, and I'm tired of living, he said. He walked out to the yard again. When I'm out here, he said, there's no place to go but in. When I'm indoors, there's no place to go but out in the yard. That's where you're wrong, my friend, said a voice. Wilbur looked through the fence and saw the goose standing there. You don't have to stay in that dirty little yard, said the goose, who talked rather fast. One of the boards is loose. Push on it, push on it, and come on out. What? Said Wilbur. Say it slower. At the risk of repeating myself, said the goose, I suggest that you come on out. It's wonderful out here. Did you say a board was loose? That I did, said the goose. Wilbur walked up to the fence and saw that the goose was right. One board was loose. He put his head down, shut his eyes, and pushed. The board gave away. In a minute, he had squeezed through the fence and was standing in the long grass outside his yard. The goose chuckled. How does it feel to be free? She asked. I like it, said Wilbur. That is, I guess I like it. Actually, Wilbur felt queer to be outside his fence with nothing between him in the big world. "Where do you think I better go?" "Anywhere you like, anywhere you like," said the goose. "Go down through the orchard, root up the sod. Go down through the garden, dig up the radishes. Root up everything, eat grass, look for corn, look for oats, run all over, skip and dance, jump and prance. Go down through the orchard and stroll in the woods. The world is a wonderful place when you're young." "I can see that," replied Wilbur. He gave a jump in the air, twirled, ran a few steps, stopped, looked all around, sniffed the smells of the afternoon, and then set off, walking down through the orchard. Pausing in the shade of an apple tree, he put his strong snout into the ground and began pushing, digging, and rooting. He felt very happy. He had plowed up quite a piece of ground before anyone noticed him. Mrs. Zuckerman was the first to see him. She saw him from the kitchen window, and she immediately shouted for the men. "Homer!" she cried. "Pigs out! Lurvy! Pigs out! Homer! Lurvy! Pigs out! He's down there under the apple tree!" "Now the trouble starts," thought Wilbur. "Now I'll catch it." The goose heard the racket, and she too started hollering. "Run, run, run, downhill! Make for the woods, the woods!" she shouted to Wilbur. "They'll never, never catch you in the woods." The cocker spaniel heard the commotion, and he ran out from the barn to join the chase. Mr. Zuckerman heard, and he came out of the machine shed where he was mending a tool. Lurvy, the hired man, heard the noise and came up from the asparagus patch where he was pulling weeds. Everybody walked toward Wilbur, and Wilbur didn't know what to do. The woods seemed a long way off, and anyway, he had never been down there in the woods and wasn't sure he would like it. "Get around behind him, Lurvy," said Mr. Zuckerman, "and drive him toward the barn. And take it easy. Don't rush him. I'll go and get a bucket of slops." The news of Wilbur's escape spread rapidly among the animals on the place. Whenever any creature broke loose on Zuckerman's farm, the event was of great interest to the others. The goose shouted to the nearest cow that Wilbur was free, and soon all the cows knew. Then one of the cows told one of the sheep, and soon all of the sheep knew. The lambs learned about it from their mothers. The horses in their stalls in the barn pricked up their ears when they heard the goose hollering, and soon the horses had caught on to what was happening. "Wilbur's out," they said. Every animal stirred and lifted its head and became excited to know that one of his friends had got free and was no longer penned up or tied fast. Wilbur didn't know what to do or which way to run. It seemed as though everybody was after him. "If this is what it's like to be free," he thought, "I believe I'd rather be penned up in my own yard." The cocker spaniel was sneaking up on him from one side. Lurvy, the hired man, was sneaking up on him from the other side. Mrs. Zuckerman stood ready to head him off if he started for the garden. And now Mr. Zuckerman was coming down toward him carrying a pail. "This is really awful," thought Wilbur. "Why doesn't Fern come?" He began to cry. The goose took command and began to give orders. "Don't just stand there, Wilbur! Dodge about, dodge about!" cried the goose. "Skip around, run toward me, slip in and out, in and out, in and out. Make for the woods, twist and turn." The cocker spaniel sprang for Wilbur's hind leg. Wilbur jumped and ran. Lurvy reached out and grabbed. Mrs. Zuckerman screamed to Lurvy. The goose cheered for Wilbur. Wilbur dodged between Lurvy's legs. Lurvy missed Wilbur, and grabbed the spaniel instead. "Nicely done, nicely done!" cried the goose. "Try it again, try it again!" "Run downhill," suggested the cows. "Run toward me," yelled the gander. "Run uphill," cried the sheep. "Turn and twist," honked the geese. "Jump and dance," said the rooster. "Look out for Lurvy," called the cows. "Look out for the Zuckerman," yelled the gander. "Watch out for the dog," cried the sheep. Listen to me," screamed the goose. Poor Wilbur was dazed and frightened by the hoopla. He didn't like being the center of all this fuss. He tried to follow the instructions his friends were giving him, but he couldn't run downhill and uphill at the same time, and he couldn't twist and turn when he was jumping and dancing. And he was crying so hard he could barely see anything that was happening. After all, Wilbur was a very young pig, not much more than a baby, really. He wished Fern were there to take him in her arms and comfort him. When he looked up and saw Mr. Zuckerman standing quite close to him, holding a pail of warm slops, he felt relieved. He lifted his nose and sniffed. The smell was delicious. Warm milk, potato skins, wheat middlings, Kellogg's cornflakes, and a popover left from the Zuckerman's breakfast. Come, pig, said Mr. Zuckerman, tapping the pail. Come, pig. Wilbur took a step toward the pail. No, 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 said the goose. It's the old pail trick, Wilbur. Don't fall for it, don't fall for it. He's trying to lure you back into captivity, ivity, ivity. He's appealing to your stomach. Wilbur didn't care. The food smelled appetizing. He took another step toward the pail. Pig, pig, said Mr. Zuckerman in a kind voice, and began walking slowly toward the barnyard, looking all about him innocently, as if he didn't know that a little white pig was following along behind him. You'll be sorry, 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 called the goose. Wilbur didn't care. He kept walking toward the pail of slops. You'll miss your freedom, honked the goose. An hour of freedom is worth a barrel of slops. Wilbur didn't care. When Mr. Zuckerman reached the pig pen, he climbed over the fence and poured the slops into the trough. Then he pulled the loose board away from the fence so that there was a wide hole for Wilbur to walk through. Reconsider, reconsider, cried the goose. Wilbur paid no attention. He stepped through the fence into his yard. He walked to the trough and took a long drink of slop, sucking in the milk hungrily and chewing the popover. It was good to be home again. While Wilbur ate, Lurvy fetched a hammer and some 8 penny nails and nailed the board in place. Then he and Mr. Zuckerman leaned lazily on the fence, and Mr. Zuckerman scratched Wilbur's back with a stick. He's quite a pig, said Lurvy. Yes, he'll make a good pig, said Mr. Zuckerman. Wilbur heard the words of praise. He felt the warm milk inside his stomach. He felt the pleasant rubbing of the stick along his itchy back. He felt peaceful and happy and sleepy. This had been a tiring afternoon. It was still only about 4 o'clock, but Wilbur was ready for bed. I'm really too young to go out into the world alone, he thought as he lay down. So I'm going to stop for a minute. Let's think about this. As I started to read today, I was thinking to myself that this was possibly realistic fiction. It has the elements of fiction. Now I know that it's fantasy fiction. At first I was thinking it was closer to Because of Winn-Dixie, but in that book, the dog doesn't talk. The dog is like my dog George that's sitting at my feet right now, where I think he's going to respond to me, but he doesn't with words. Whereas today, what we're reading, the animals are talking to one another. We're learning and hearing what Wilbur is thinking. I love that last line. I'm really too young to go out into the world alone. So we're hearing his thoughts. So this is definitely a fantasy book, more like the author's other book, Stuart Little, and much like the book that we just read, Thief of Always, as a whole school. So now I'm moving forward and I'm thinking about the elements of fantasy, that things that might be magical, and that was a word used on the back that now I'm rethinking about. So I'm looking for the animals to be talking to one another, and now I'm anticipating that it has the fiction elements, but there are animals talking and possibly some magic might come about. So we'll move on and read into the chapter, Loneliness. The next day was rainy and dark. Rain fell on the roof of the barn and dripped steadily from the eaves. Rain fell in the barnyard, and rain in crooked courses down into the lane where thistles and pigwood grew. Rain splattered against Mrs. Zuckerman's kitchen windows and came gushing out of the downspouts. Rain fell on the backs of the sheep as they grazed in the meadow. When the sheep tired of standing in the rain, they walked slowly up the lane and into the fold. Rain upset Wilbur's plans. Wilbur had planned to go out this day and dig a new hole in his yard. He had other plans too. His plans for the day went something like this. Breakfast at 6:30, skim milk, crusts, middlings, bits of donuts, wheat cakes with drops of maple syrup sticking to them, potato skins, leftover custard pudding with raisins, and bits of shredded wheat. Breakfast would be finished by 7. From 7 to 8, Wilbur planned to have a talk with Templeton, the rat that lived under his trough. Talking with Templeton was not the most interesting occupation in the world, but it was better than nothing. From 8 to 9, Wilbur planned to take a nap outdoors in the sun. From 9 to 11, he planned to dig a hole or trench and possibly find something good to eat buried in the dirt. From 11 to 12, he planned to stand still and watch flies on the boards, watch bees in the clover, and watch swallows in the air. 12 o'clock lunchtime, middlings, warm water, apple parings, meat gravy, carrot scraps, meat scraps, stale hominy, and the wrapper of the package of cheese. Lunch would be over at 1. From 1 to 2, Wilbur planned to sleep. From 2 to 3, he planned to scratch itchy places by rubbing against the fence. From 3 to 4, he planned to stand perfectly still and think of what it was like to be alive and to wait for Fern. At 4 would come supper, skim milk, provender, leftover sandwich from Lurvy's lunchbox, prune skins, a morsel of this, a bit of that, fried tomatoes, marmalade drippings, a little more of this, a little more of that, a piece of baked apple, a scrap of upside down cake. Wilbur had gone to sleep thinking about all of these plans. He awoke at 6 and saw the rain, and it seemed as though he couldn't bear it. I get everything all beautifully planned out, and it has to go and rain, he said. For a while, he stood gloomily indoors. Then he walked to the door and looked out. Drops of rain stuck on his face. His yard was cold and wet. His trough had an inch of rainwater in it. Templeton was nowhere to be found. "Are you out there, Templeton?" called Wilbur. There was no answer. Suddenly, Wilbur felt lonely and friendless. Mitchell Mustangs, we're going to stop there today. And I invite you to think about genre as you read your independent reading book today. And as you read, sometimes we think it's one genre, and then we add in more information comes to us and we realize, okay, this is fiction and it's this type of fiction. So it helps us as we read to anticipate elements of that particular type of genre that help us to make meaning. So thank you so much, Mitchell Mustangs, for watching and reading along with this video, independent reading, and your reader's response that all of the language arts teachers will look forward to collecting and reading on April 13th. My last thing to say to you is to stay healthy and happy reading and writing.